Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back in Copenhagen. Thank you, my hosts. Thank you, audience, for turning up. I still, by the way, just before I start, should say there's a sort of first principle point one should make, which is one should still register how ludicrous it is that we now talk about the cartoon crisis. And just accept it, people say. 11 years ago, if you'd have said, well, there'll be a big cartoon crisis in Europe in the coming years, people would have said, what? It's like a Mickey Mouse atrocity, a Bugs Bunny outrage. It's surreal, but it's what Salman Rushdie said after the Satanic Verses affair. He said, I felt like I'd fallen through the looking glass, and I didn't know if I'd ever get back. We've all fallen through that looking glass in the last 10 years, if not before, but I wanted to talk in this short time I have to you and with you about a question of what have we learned. It's very tempting to say we've learned absolutely nothing in the last 10 years. I just came from London, and just before I left, went to see an exhibition in London which is finishing tomorrow. Some of you will know the organisers. It's called the Passion for Freedom Art Festival. It's now in its 7th year. It's a wonderful art exhibition which does all those things that artists and art curators pretend they do, you know. It actually is about freedom of speech. It's actually about free expression. It's actually about all those things that the art world likes to say it's about. And it's got this year, among other things, the work of a young female Iranian artist who's currently in prison in Iran for her work. It's very moving to see this artwork by a girl imprisoned in Iran exhibited in London on the same road as Buckingham Palace. However, I mention it because of a sadder note. They've always had problems, this exhibition, Passion for Freedom, now in its 7th year. They've always had problems. They had to move galleries several years ago because the gallery owners got scared about the artwork and so on. And it ought to be remembered, of course, it's particular artwork. I mean, there's quite a bit of artwork this year from Ukrainian artists about freedom, quite understandably so. But that's not what bothers the new health and safety, as it were. This year, the exhibition is on Pall Mall in the centre of London, and one of the artworks by a Middle Eastern artist, a female Middle Eastern artist who works under the pseudonym of Mimsy, was withdrawn from the exhibition at the request of the police. Now, the police were shown by the art gallery which this exhibition happens in, were shown the artwork, as it were, to vet the artwork that would go in. And this particular piece, which had been exhibited before, didn't meet the required standards of the British police. And so it was removed. And I don't at all blame the organisers for this, who fought as much of a fight as anyone could and managed to keep other pieces in the exhibition. But of course then there's a secondary one. If you keep this piece in, you'll need security of a bigger magnitude at all of the things, and that's going to cost you. So bit by bit, the language of health and safety meets the language of insurance companies, and it becomes routine that the British police become our art censors. I just about trust the police to catch burglars and stop robbers and muggings. But I don't trust them at all as art critics. And it's bizarre that that is a situation which we've come to. We have come to a situation, as people have said about the Satanic Verses affair, where we've internalized the fatwa. As societies, we've internalized this. And this is one of the things which I think we've learned most clearly from the last 10 years. We've internalized the, absurd to use a phrase still, Mohammed cartoon crisis. But we have learned some things in the last 10 years, and I'll dwell on them for a moment. We've learned, in as clear a way as could possibly have been learned by anybody, that most of the press in free Western countries are cowards. We've learned that most of our artistic establishment are cowards, and that most of our politicians are cowards. We've learned that industries... We've learned that industries that spend much of their year in awards ceremonies patting themselves and each other on the back for their bravery stop when an actual act of bravery may be required. We have watched as the entire liberal class of artists and writers and thinkers stop just at the point where bravery is needed. We've learned once again, for the first time in some centuries in Europe, about blasphemy. Again, if 20 years ago you'd have said the early years of the 21st century in Europe will be dominated by a discussion of blasphemy, people would have said, what? You don't mean repeal of blasphemy laws. You mean, no, actually the discussion about blasphemy. Probably the next thing people would have said was, when did the Spanish Inquisition get back into Europe? How did that happen? No, this is a different type of blasphemy we're talking about. Nobody would have believed you. They'd have thought all of your critical faculties were off, all your prediction mechanisms had gone awry. But that's what the 21st century, not just in Europe, but in a lot of Western countries, is dominated by. Often it's a subterranean conversation. Often it goes above that level. Canada, once again, is debating more blasphemy laws. Mark Steyn knows this better than anybody by personal experience, but just recently there is another attempt to impose effectively blasphemy laws in Canada. Of course, it's said that this will only have tried to scoop up the most extreme speech and so on, but no. Already the self-appointed censors in Canada are saying that they're looking forward to prosecuting people who engage in so-called hate speech about Islam. The problem they're going to keep on coming across is the problem of facts. It's going to be deeply disturbing for them, but it'll keep on going. I put it to you, what happens in Canada when the new blasphemy laws are in, even stricter blasphemy laws? What happens when the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa is attacked again by Islamic fundamentalists, as it was last year? What happens? What can the free press say about that? What can they say about the motivations of the attacker? Wouldn't it be better if, in the end, the Canadian judiciary and political system could make sure that no press are able to report an attack on the Canadian Parliament because it's not news? Wouldn't it be easier? They now talk about $10,000 fines on people who transgress the new blasphemy laws. Wouldn't it be easier just to have a direct debit system from the bank accounts of every journalist in case they say something about an attack on the Canadian Parliament that an Islamic terrorist has just carried out? Or should they perhaps not say anything about the motivations? Should they just pretend like President Hollande and other French officials did last December when there were a set of extreme Islamists who in cars drove into French pedestrians shouting Allahu Akbar, and President Hollande and all the other French political leaders pretended these were rather mundane, routine traffic accidents? Will it be easier just to pretend these things away? Well, we've learned some other things in the last 10 years. 5 years ago, almost precisely, we learned from Angela Merkel that multiculturalism had failed. 4 years ago, we learned the same thing from President Sarkozy and from Prime Minister Cameron. It's not clear exactly what they meant by that. In fact, as was alluded to earlier, it becomes curiouser and curiouser. It's very strange looking back. What did they mean by that? If multiculturalism was integration, among other things, which was one of the things that Angela Merkel seemed exercised by, why would multiculturalism have failed when migration was at a relatively low point, but it would be just fine when migration was at a higher point than it's ever been in our history? Why would integration not work when migration is relatively low, but we'll have to keep quiet when it's a lot higher? This isn't clear to me, and I'm sure it's not clear to very many of you. We learned a lot of other things. We learned that our politicians are incredibly good at dealing with secondary problems. Let me give you a couple of examples. Whenever anything has happened in Europe of any popular attempt to register discontent about the weakness of our political elites, the politicians have been incredibly good at coming down on that secondary reaction. So in the UK, when somebody called Tommy Robinson started a movement called the English Defence League, I didn't agree with it, I didn't like what it did, but he started this. It was a movement, a street protest movement. When he started that, very soon afterwards, his own house was raided by police, his family's houses were raided by police, computers were taken away, and they managed to get him to prison on a mortgage fraud case. They sifted through everything in him, in his background, everything in his life, everything in his family's life. They found something, he went to prison. Mortgage fraud is bad, don't get me wrong. But it seemed rather obvious to some of us that the reason he was in prison was not because of the mortgage fraud, but because he was a problem, and people, particularly our politicians, wanted that problem to go away. My point about this is, Tommy Robinson, the EDL, was a secondary symptom of a problem. They were the result of politicians rightly being seen not to have done anything with the primary problem. And the question some of us have kept on asking is, if you could do that with that person who caused you a problem, why couldn't you do it with the people that person was objecting to? Why couldn't you send the police into the houses of every extreme Islamist mullah in Britain, every radical preacher in Britain? I can bet some of them have got some dodgy mortgage stuff on the books. I can bet you'll get some of them on a technicality to do with something they've done once. But that's not the aim. The aim is to go to the secondary problem. Another example, Chancellor Merkel in her New Year message on the Pegida protests. I don't agree with the Pegida protests particularly. That's not the point. It is a legitimate movement of people saying that they dislike some of the things that are happening in their country. But that is not... their primary concern was not what Angela Merkel was concerned about. She and the entire administration of her government turns on the reaction to the problem. So in her New Year's message, she says that the Pegida protesters have coldness in their hearts. Why does she not say the Islamists who the Pegida protesters are concerned about have the most incredible coldness in their hearts? That is our primary problem. We must be careful as Germans not to have too much coldness in our own hearts, but that is the problem. No, we have a political class that believes that you can solve these problems by dealing with the secondary symptoms. It is like going to a body racked with disease and solving a skin inflammation. This is a magnificent problem of our time, the inability to grapple with the primary problem. We've learned other things, though, of course. We learned in January this year that absolutely everybody seemed to be Charlie. We learned that Mahmoud Abbas was Charlie. We learned that every politician who has spent the last 10 years calling cartoonists inflammatory and Islamophobic and right-wing and fundamentalists and Enlightenment fundamentalists and troublemakers and so on, was Charlie for about an hour. Because we learned very soon after that almost nobody was Charlie. We learned in the end, sadly, that even Charlie wasn't Charlie when earlier this year, perfectly understandably, surviving members of the staff of Charlie Hebdo said they didn't want to keep drawing Mohammed. We've learned other things. We've learned, I would submit, in the last 10 years how incredibly slowly our societies crawl towards truths which should be self-evident. We have spent the last 10 years still going around the circumlocution of whether or not Islam is a religion of peace. We have had so many variations on this circumlocution now that I keep a small notebook that's pretty much filled with them. My favourite is the movement from this terrorist attack has nothing to do with Islam to it has nothing to do with Islam and Islam is in any case a religion of peace, to Barack Obama's best hit ever, which came last year after an American hostage was decapitated in Syria. And Barack Obama said, it not only doesn't have anything to do with Islam, it has less to do with Islam than any other religion. So, if somebody cuts off someone's head while shouting Allahu Akbar, the Buddhists should get it. long before anybody else. Long before. The Quakers should have it coming to them. Anyhow, we've learned that. We've learned that it's incredibly slow, our movement towards the truth. But let me give you one, sorry it's only the day, and this is another very graphic example. Let me give you one example of how bad that slow movement towards the truth is. 30 years ago in my country, we had legislation put in place to make it illegal to carry out female genital mutilation. To date, there has not been one prosecution for this that's been successful. It took, indeed, until a couple of years ago to have any attempted prosecution for female genital mutilation. There have been, as I say, this has been on the statute books for 30 years, and tens of thousands of British girls have been mutilated in this way. Now, I remember 14 years ago or so when Ayaan Hirsi Ali started speaking about this in Holland, and others started speaking about it in Scandinavia and elsewhere. I remember about 10 years ago I published a report on FGM in the UK. Throughout most of this time, this was still a culturally sensitive, as they say, subject to talk about. And it was a difficult one. You could feel it as you mentioned it in public. In the last few years, it's become a bit easier. The Evening Standard in Britain ran a campaign against FGM. The Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, joined the campaign. All sorts of politicians from across the political spectrum came out in support of the campaign against FGM. Let me put it to you like this. If you were to select a subject which should be the easiest subject in the world to get total political and popular support for, does anything get easier than saying we are against the mutilation of young girls' genitals with knives? I can't think of anything. That should be as easy as it gets. It should be a home run. And it's taken 30 years to even get it to being a legitimate political conversation, and one which has still had no practical repercussions. That, I would suggest, is a sign that if we are learning, we're really slow learners. Now, I would say, as I come to wrapping up, it doesn't have to be like this, and it never did have to be like this. There are always signs, there are always occasional flickers and glimmers of hope. I thought that your Prime Minister, Rasmussen, gave us one such glimmer early on in the cartoon crisis, when a delegation of alleged community leaders said they wanted to see him about it. And he said, of my understanding, he said that he wouldn't see them because they would have to learn that in Denmark was a free society with a government that was separate from the free press, and that these things were separate, and that the sooner these people learned that, the better. We could have done that. We could have done a lot more of that. We could have had a lot less kowtowing. We could have had a lot more basic standing up for our own principles. But by and large, we failed. If I may, I would say there is an important aspect to the British tradition of free speech in this regard, and it's the one I know most about, so you'll pardon me if I'm not mentioning Danish philosophers for the moment. But the British principle of freedom of speech was always, it's not a right, it's not something you are born with and it comes from nowhere. It's a necessity, and it's a necessity to keep a society free. Because the reason why free speech in the British tradition came about, through Milton, Mill and others, was that you had to hear dissident voices, you had to hear contrary opinions, because only if you could hear those opinions and allowed yourself to hear them and to read them and to see them and to view them, could you first of all work out if you yourself were in error. If you were in error, it would strengthen the truth which you held by hearing a contrary opinion. But also, it was possible, and it remains possible today, that contrary opinion, that minority opinion against the overwhelming consensus of your time, might turn out to be right. And if it does turn out to be right, you should not disable yourself from being able to hear it, from being able to read it, from being able to see it. That's why freedom of speech matters. It's because it's the only way we have to avoid error. And that is why what has happened in the last 10 years, and the intimidation and the attempt to shut debate down by people who come in through the front door with Kalashnikovs, and cowardly, cringing officials and others who come through the back door with legislation and so on, are so much part of this problem. Because we need to hear this contrary opinion, because it may just be the case, and I submit to you that it is, that what has been seen to be the contrary opinion in recent years was the opinion that was right, which is that there is a problem, and something about which we should be concerned, and which is going on in our society, and that we would like to stop it. Now, in wrapping up, I would just say this. it seems to me that the thing I've certainly learned most in the last 10 years is this. Freedom never was a very popular idea. It's serious. If you look back in history, at almost any phase, not just the mid-20th century, which is all anyone seems to know about these days, but almost any period in history, most people weren't bothered particularly about freedom. They wanted security, and they wanted safety, and they wanted a comfortable and an easy life, and they wanted to be cozy. Freedom of speech was only ever defended by a few people, just as freedom in general was only ever defended by a few people. But maybe it only ever needed a few people. One of the proudest things of my life in recent years has been coming to Denmark, making some very good friends here, of getting to know Lars, Flemming, Hella, and a whole set of other people who are among the few people. There are some in America, some in Canada, one or two in Britain, a few on the continent. But I would say, in wrapping up, that one of the things I think you could be proudest of is that when the history of this era is written, and it will be written, and I'm more optimistic than Henrik, that when it does come to be written, the name of Denmark will be able to be talked about with enormous pride. Thank you.